Today, I want to talk about how I captured these unique panning motorsport shots that went viral on Instagram. About a month ago, I shared this video. It currently has 2.3 million views on Instagram, and even Visco commented, so I must be doing something right. But a lot of people were wondering how I captured these photos. So today I want to walk through exactly how I used my camera, the camera settings, focal length, editing, everything that I did to capture a photo like this. Some people were even wondering if these were image stacks or photoshopped in some way. So let's get into how you can capture these photos too. First, I have to give credit to my friend, Rich Hornby. He's a professional motorsport photographer and he is much better at this than I am. He is the one that taught me everything I know about panning and choosing the right shutter speed for motorsport photography. And he also showed me this specific spot on the track. So without him, I wouldn't have been able to capture these photos at all. I'll link his Instagram in the description. He's an awesome motorsport photographer. If you want more of that kind of content, check him out. Also, because of the amount of requests I got on this video, I did set up a print shop where I'm selling prints of this collection. So if you do like these photos and you want to buy a print, that link's down there too. I actually have one on the wall behind me. It looks pretty cool. So here's how these photos actually work. No, they're not image stacks. They're not photoshopped. This effect is done entirely in camera. And I'm gonna show you how to do it, but first it's important to know why this works. So this is a long exposure panning shot. That means the shutter is open for a longer period of time, letting in more light as we pan across the track. This creates the motion blur. Then I track the car as it moves through the scene. And if I do it right, then I keep the car perfectly still in the frame relative to how the camera's moving, which means over the period of the long exposure, the car is still sharp because it technically wasn't moving within my frame. But because I'm going like this, the background and everything around the car is moving quite fast, and that becomes blurred or streaked. So the longer the shutter speed, the longer those streaks will be, but also the more difficult it will be to get a sharp photo of the car. But there's another element that makes these images look the way they do. They're not just a regular panning photo. They have a lot of really abstract looking streaks going through the image, and that is because we had foreground. The location where we shot these photos made a massive difference in the visual style. Again, props to Rich for showing me this spot because we were so far out of the way to get this shot. We were in the forest next to the track and we actually didn't have a clear view of the track. This is what it looked like on my phone. And this is basically what we could see. We could kind of see a strip of the track and we could kind of see the cars as they went through, but it was pretty obstructed. But this actually ended up benefiting us when it came to the outcome of the images, because if we were to shoot this at a high shutter speed, like 1/200th of a second, and there was no motion blur, you actually would never be able to see the entire car at any given time as it was driving by us because the view was too obstructed. But because we were doing a long exposure and we were photographing the car as it was coming through all of the gaps in the trees and leaves, we actually were able to piece together the entire car into one image as it's driving by. Because with the long exposure, you have about 1/4 of a second of exposure time. And within that time, because the car is moving so fast, there's a lot of little gaps in the trees. And as the car drives by and we capture it, parts of the car at a time are exposed to the sensor. And by the time the exposure has finished, we've seen pretty much the entire car through all the different gaps at different periods of time throughout the exposure, which I think makes this even cooler because we're not just seeing a photo of the car as a whole, we're actually seeing a photo of the car just naturally pieced together by a long exposure through different holes in the patches of leaves, which is kind of crazy to me. And you can actually see where this effect falls apart a little bit for some of the photos where I didn't track the car perfectly. I'll show you what that looks like. You can kind of see there are some artifacts here where parts of the car are there, but they don't fit in with the other parts of the car because I just didn't track it perfectly as I went through the shot. All right, I'm gonna take a second to talk about today's video sponsor, which of course is Artlist. If you've seen one of my videos before, you know I'm already a big fan of Artlist. I use their music in all of my social media content creation. I use their music and their sound effects in my video productions, wedding films, commercial projects, everything. My favorite part about Artlist is that you pay for one license and it covers everything. Not only that, but Artlist has just become such a massive library of resources. You have so much music from so many different genres, but now you also have a ton of sound effects. They even have AI voiceover, so you can type out your script and have an AI voiceover read it back. It's honestly crazy, especially compared to the old route of just licensing individual songs every time you needed something for a project. This is so much more cost effective. And especially if you're the type of person where right now, when you need a song, you just Google non-copyright, royalty-free music and then try and download some random song you find. This is the next step up. This is how you take your video production to the next level. So don't wait, check Artlist out now. Use my link in the description and you get an extra 2 months free when you sign up. Now that you have an understanding of why this works, here's how you can actually do it. First, you want to find a part of the track with some foreground. I think the trees look cool, but you can accomplish this with any kind of foreground, people or fences or other cars, any kind of obstacle partially blocking the track. Then you need to set your exposure. This will change depending on your focal length and how close you are to the track. But remember, the longer your exposure is, the harder it will be to get a sharp image. So it's also going to depend on your skill level. For my exposure, I was shooting at 200 millimeters, which is fairly zoomed in, not insanely zoomed in, but you know, it's getting there. And I switched it up for some of the photos, but for the most part, I was shooting at 1/25th of a second, which is also kind of in that middle ground of it's not insanely slow like some professional motorsport photographers can do, but it's also not very fast. If you're just starting out, I'd recommend more like 1/80th of a second or 1/100th of a second, just so you can kind of get that practice down a little bit. If you want more tips on the actual panning and motorsport photography in general and how to stand and everything, watch my motorsport photography video that I did last year. I did a whole interview with Rich and we talked about all these nice little pro tips that a lot of people don't know about motorsport photography, and that could actually potentially really help you out if you're just getting started. Check that video out. I'll put it in the little eye thing in the corner. But back to camera settings. Next, we have to set our aperture. Now, because we are using shutter speed to create the motion blur, that is already creating separation between our subject and the background and the foreground. So the normal need to have a low aperture in order to create background separation is not really necessary. And in fact, a higher aperture will actually help us out here a bit because, and I'm gonna get to this, the focusing on the track is gonna be a lot trickier when we can't fully see the cars. So a higher aperture is actually going to be totally fine, and I would say, depending on your situation, a little bit encouraged. So don't be afraid to go up to f5.6, f8, f11, whatever is going to get you the correct exposure and get those images sharp. Then I like to set my ISO ideally to 100, but that's not always possible. In the forest here, I think it was more like 800 because we were in a bit of a darker area with all the trees covering us. If you're using a camera made within the last 5 years, maybe even the past 8 years, cameras have gotten really good with their ability to bring up the ISO. So if you have to shoot at 800, 1600 ISO on a modern camera, it's not going to be a problem. So we're looking at shutter speed around 1/25th of a second to 1/80th of a second, depending on your skill level. Then we're looking at an aperture of 5.6 to 11 probably. And then your ISO is going to be set to whatever is going to get you that correct exposure. So one of the most frequent questions I got on this post was, how did I nail the exposure on the track when I could barely see the cars? This is where that higher aperture helps a little bit. So I actually set my camera to manual focus, and I used the digital zoom on my camera to just kind of zoom in on a point through the trees where I could see the track. And I pre-focused on the track. Now, because I was shooting at a bit of a higher aperture, it was okay that I didn't get this absolutely perfectly because the whole area was going to be in focus anyways. So it's pre-focused, manual focus, and then as the cars come by, I just keep my body locked in as still as possible and I track the car throughout the scene. Another tip, if this isn't already obvious, if your camera has a high-speed shutter mode, use it. If you can capture, 8, 12 photos, the R6 does, I think, 12 photos per second in mechanical shutter mode. Do that. Don't use an electronic shutter. When you're moving this fast, you might get some weird artifacts. But if you can shoot at like 10, 12 photos per second, that's going to make a huge difference, because even though I have a little bit of experience doing this, not a ton, but a little bit, I still got a ton of missed photos here. We spent probably half an hour at this spot just taking photos of the cars going by. Just in this spot alone with this camera, I shot probably close to 1,000 photos, because every time the cars went by, I was just holding down that shutter and spraying. And then within those, some of those photos, I happened to track the car perfectly for that 1/25th of a second, and the car looked sharp. For a lot of them, that wasn't the case. Generally speaking, in photography, it's not great advice to just say, spray and pray and hopefully you get the right shot. But in this case, you want to set yourself up as best as possible. And then, yeah, take as many photos as you can to increase those chances that you're going to be tracking the car properly in one of them. The post-processing for these images was actually really simple. Just some exposure correction, some contrast, some saturation, and then a tiny bit of cropping sometimes to center the car within the frame. That's about it, because most of what we're doing here happens in camera. If you're a fan of how these photos look, I do have that print shop set up, linked down below. Unfortunately, it's only available in Canada and the US, but you can order regular paper prints and metallic prints. I got a metal print and I have to say, I really like it. I'm not just saying that so you buy one. I think it's actually pretty cool. And of course, check out Artlist as well. Link is in the description. If you guys have any other questions about this type of motorsport photography, let me know, or comment on some of Rich's posts asking him questions. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer. Now that I say that, I didn't ask him if I could say that, so maybe go easy on him. But he is the guy with all of the real, experienced, professional answers. I can help out where I can. But that's about it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.